In the dim blue glow of the Vraxan council chamber, Ambassador Gar had never felt more assured. He leaned back, his scaly arms crossed, while his sharp gaze swept over the humans in front of him, seated and silent. They were smaller, physically unimpressive, and dressed in simple uniforms that looked like nothing more than scraps compared to the heavy armored attire of his own kind. "You see," Gar began, his words rolling out like a challenge, "Vraxan forces could dismantle your fleet within a cycle. Your kind, though persistent, lacks the might to resist." His tone had a theatrical lilt to it, the kind that played well for his people, known for their displays of power. The lead human, an officer named Wallace, simply nodded, the corners of his mouth curving upward in a restrained smile. "We don't intend to pick a fight, Ambassador. We'd rather avoid conflict." This seemed to amuse Gar, who let out a throaty laugh. "Avoid conflict?" His eyes gleamed. "You overestimate your negotiation position. We have numbers, strength, and technology to rival anything your ships could muster. Even this dimensional distortion you boast of, it's ineffective, at best." But Gar's mirth faded when he noticed the humans exchanged glances, barely masking their amusement. Wallace, still calm, leaned forward, locking eyes with Gar. "I think you misunderstand, Ambassador. Our strength isn't in our weapons alone." With a flick of his wrist, Wallace triggered something, and suddenly, an audible hum filled the air. The lights dimmed further, and with them, the air shifted and rippled like disturbed water. From behind Wallace, a section of the chamber wall twisted, then tore open, as if reality itself bent under an unseen force. "Meet the dimensional pocket," Wallace said softly, a tinge of steel in his voice. "Or, as we call it, a little surprise." Gar felt a chill trickle down his spine. He'd heard rumors, of course, whispers of technology that could bend space, but to see it in action was unnerving. Objects were appearing within the pocket, taking shape, as if they'd always existed but were hidden away in a fold of space. Small, unassuming devices hovered in the air, radiating faint pulses, hums that Gar's instincts immediately marked as dangerous. "Human tricks," he scoffed, though his voice faltered slightly. "Nothing more than illusions." Wallace gestured, and one of the devices floated up, targeting a metal chair across the room. In a blink, the chair was disintegrated, vaporized in a silent flash that left nothing but a faint wisp in its place. Gar's eyes widened, and his confidence began to unravel. "These aren't tricks," Wallace replied quietly. "These are fields capable of destabilizing matter itself. They're small, they're mobile, and yes, thanks to our dimensional tech, they can appear anywhere, and everywhere." Gar struggled to maintain his composure, eyes darting around as the devices blinked in and out of view, as though stalking unseen prey. The silent intensity of the humans was unsettling, unlike the bombast he'd expected. He swallowed, a lump forming in his throat. Wallace continued, voice steady, almost conversational. "You see, Ambassador, we're quite aware we look fragile, easily underestimated, but that's why we invested in the things that matter." His gaze didn't waver. "We're not warriors by instinct, like your kind. We think differently, adapt differently, and we build to survive." "Survive?" Gar spat, struggling to regain control of the conversation. "You act as though we'd come to obliterate you, wouldn't you?" Wallace's eyes flickered with a cold understanding. "We know your history. Expansion, domination. You didn't come to talk, Ambassador. You came to judge how quickly you could conquer." The silence that followed was thicker than the chamber's dim atmosphere, pressing down like a weight. Gar's confidence crumbled as the sheer gravity of his miscalculation dawned on him. Finally, one of his aides, a silent Vraxan standing rigid in the shadows, muttered in their native tongue, "We underestimated them." Gar's hand shot out, silencing the aide, but he knew it was too late. The humans had seen and understood. Wallace leaned back, folding his hands with an unsettling calmness. "We don't want a war, Ambassador, but we're ready for one. We've learned enough from watching species like yours, watching how they see small, unthreatening creatures and assume there's no power there. But humans, we are survivors. We grow, we learn, and we prepare." There was no boast in his words, only a simple statement of fact. Gar felt his options narrow. The Vraxan Empire was formidable, but against the technology he'd just witnessed, against humans who had prepared for exactly this confrontation, He realized his people would suffer heavy losses, perhaps unacceptable ones. After a long silence, Gar lowered his head, a flicker of humility creeping into his voice. Very well, he conceded, his words slow and measured. Perhaps we misjudged you, an error we won't repeat. Wallace's nod was almost imperceptible, but Gar caught it, a small gesture of respect between warriors, unspoken, yet understood. As Gar and his entourage filed out of the chamber, Wallace allowed himself a final smile, one that remained unseen by their guests.